Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called 3 USO Cases with Humanoids. USOs, unidentified submersible objects, are relatively rare, certainly compared to UFOs, and USO cases involving humanoids are even more rare, exceedingly rare. And what's interesting about these 3 cases that I'm presenting here is that they all occurred in the same general area, which is off the southern California coast, specifically along the coastline overlooking the San Pedro Santa Catalina Channel. This is a very active area with hundreds of cases on record. However, only very few involve humanoids. So that's why I wanted to do this episode. And the first case I call Case 1, Landing at Playa Del Rey. This is actually a classic case. It's appeared in numerous UFO books and is quite interesting and also controversial, though it has never been proven a hoax. And I've been able to locate some very interesting corroboration of this event. It occurred very early in the morning at about 5:40 a.m. when a witness, a General Electric Company employee by the name of Richard Kehoe, was driving along a street called Vista del Mar. This street runs directly along the beach there, very close to the water itself. And as Richard was driving very early in the morning, suddenly his car stalled. And as he exits his car, he sees that his car is not the only one that has stalled. In fact, there are 3 other cars that also stalled at the same time. So clearly this is no coincidence. The other 2 witnesses include Ronald Burke of Redondo Beach and Joe Thomas of Torrance. And as these 3 gentlemen exit their cars, all of them notice something that has landed on the beach only a few yards away from them, so very close. It's a large egg-shaped object, and they described it as being surrounded in a bluish haze, and the object itself was tan or cream in color and had 2 large metallic rings around it. And the object itself appeared to be resting on these metallic rings. And as these 3 witnesses are observing this object, they are shocked to see 2 strange-looking figures emerge. And according to the witnesses, these figures had sort of yellowish green skin and were wearing what appeared to be black leather pants, white belts, and light-colored jerseys. These 2 strange figures approached the 3 men and began to ask them all kinds of bizarre questions in what appeared to be perhaps a foreign language or garbled English. It's not quite clear, but the gentlemen could understand them but had difficulty understanding them. And according to the main witness, Richard Kehoe, and I quote, "I don't expect anyone will believe me except someone else who's seen the same thing. We were so frightened we couldn't think of much of anything. They wanted to know where we were going, who we were, what time it was, and questions like that. Their skin seemed to be a sort of yellowish green, but they looked like Earth people to me." So this was a very brief encounter. After asking them this series of questions, the 2 figures quickly returned to this egg-shaped craft, which promptly took off upwards, zipped away very quickly, and was gone. And as soon as this craft left, all of the 4 cars immediately started back up, and the witnesses continued on their way. One of the witnesses, Joe Thomas, was particularly frightened by this encounter, and he called the police to report it. And it was this that caused this case to become well known. It caught the attention of reporters who were able to locate the witnesses and speak with them, or at least to Richard Kehoe. And the case quickly became very well known. One of the researchers who looked into it was a researcher by the name of Isabel Epperson, and she tried very hard to locate the witnesses, could not find Ronald Burke or Joe Thomas, but did eventually locate Richard Kehoe, who refused to talk to her. However, Richard Kehoe did appear on a television program. It was called The Confidential Files, and it was hosted by Paul V. Coates, who would often tackle controversial issues. And according to Paul V. Coates, Richard Kehoe did appear on his show and discussed this incident in some detail. So it's a very interesting case, to say the least. Isabel Epperson wasn't entirely convinced that the witnesses were being truthful, although she was not able to talk to them directly. However, what's really interesting about this case is it's not an isolated event. Not only did it occur in an area which has an enormous amount of activity, on that week, in fact on that day, there were many, many other cases across the United States and the world. In fact, I did another episode on this called 1 Week in November, because on this same week in November 1957, there are quite literally dozens of cases, scores of cases, involving UFOs that stopped vehicles, caused electromagnetic interference of all kinds. This was quite alarming. This type of event to this extreme degree has never occurred before or since, in terms of the number of cases involving vehicles that malfunctioned as a result of a close-up UFO encounter. So this is by no means unique. This 1 week in November was a huge kind of display that was going on all across the country and the world. And this case here in Playa del Rey was just one of them. And that's not all. There is further stunning confirmation of this event. And in fact, strengthening the credibility of this account are several sightings which occurred on the same day in the same location. It was about 10 hours later at 3:50 p.m., and this is just about 50 miles to the south, not far as the UFO flies. A commanding officer and 12 airmen from an Air Force weather detachment at Long Beach sighted no less than 6 saucer-shaped objects zooming across the sky just under a 7,000-foot cloud cover. And it was 2 hours later, sometime between 6:05 and 7:25 p.m., that additional officers at the Los Alamitos Naval Air Station reported seeing, quote, numerous, end quote, objects zooming overhead. And at the same time, local police stations in Long Beach reported receiving hundreds, more than 100 calls from Long Beach citizens reporting UFOs. So this is really good confirmation that something very strange was going on that day in this area. It's certainly an unusual case, and that's why I wanted to include it here. The second case I'd like to present here, I call a Catalina USO with humanoids. We owe this case to Marvin Miles, who was a newspaper aerospace editor for actually the LA Times. And he wrote an article about this incident, and if not for him, it probably would have gone unrecorded. This incident occurred just before dawn on the morning of July 28, 1962, when a chartered fishing boat was fishing in the Santa Catalina Channel about 6 miles southeast of Avalon Harbor. The skipper, who is anonymous, noticed some lights that appeared to be floating stationary on the water, and he headed his boat towards these mysterious lights and trained his binoculars on them. And to his amazement, he saw some sort of structure of some kind. And as this captain says, and I quote, "It appeared to be the stern of a submarine. We could see 5 men, 2 in all-white garb, 2 in dark trousers and white shirts, and 1 in a sky-blue jumpsuit. We passed a beam at about a quarter mile, and I was certain it was a submarine low in the water, steel gray, no markings, decks almost awash, with only its tail and an odd aft structure showing." This fishing boat captain assumed that he was seeing a Russian submarine, though it was very unusual for a Russian submarine to be this close to the shore and remain in view. And then more strange stuff started to happen. This submarine performed a maneuver which left the captain totally amazed. This quote, submarine started to move forward towards the fishing boat as if attempting to ram it. And in fact, it came so close that the captain had to turn his boat to avoid the sub, which moved past them at high speeds. And here's where it gets even stranger. It emitted no noise and left no wake except for, quote, a good-sized swell. So this alarmed the fishing captain, and he reported it to the Navy. And the Navy took detailed statements and attempted to identify the sub by showing this captain various photographic comparisons of subs from other countries, Germany, Japan, Russia, and so forth. And this fishing captain was not able to identify it as any sub from any of these countries. So that is also unusual. And this is when Marvin Miles, the aerospace editor for the LA Times, stepped in. He heard about this incident and called the Navy to verify it. And he was told, quote, "There's nothing to it." But Marvin Miles believed there was something to it and ended up writing a story in a column about, quote, Soviet subs. But this is definitely a strange incident. Is this a submarine, or is this a USO with humanoids? It's hard to say, but there are some strange elements to it. Not only is this USO odd looking, it did not look like any submarine they could identify, but the people who were on the deck were dressed strangely, particularly the gentleman in the blue jumpsuit, which is often what we hear with humanoids. And of course there's the strange way this object behaved, trying to ram the fishing boat, remaining in full view. At any rate, UFO researchers Jim and Coral Lorenzen heard about this case, and they wrote about it and feel that it could very well be a USO piloted by ETs. And as they say, and I quote, "The high surface speed, the lack of wake and sound, and the huge swell makes this object suspect." To that I would also add the odd shape of the submarine itself and its lack of fear of being observed. So definitely something is very strange going on here. It's absolutely unusual for a submarine to be that close to Catalina Island, to the shore of the United States. It's certainly possible it was a sub, but it may have been something else entirely. And Jim and Coral Lorenzen seem to be convinced that it was. And that's why I wanted to include it here. But what I really want to talk about is this third case, which I call a Case 3, Lake Casitas UFO with humanoid. This is a very unusual case, and I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like this. It may in fact be unique in all of the UFO, USO literature. Lake Casitas is a small lake. It's an artificial lake located just inland off the coast of Ventura on the north end of the Santa Catalina Channel. There was no lake there until 1959 when a dam was built which formed Lake Casitas. And then comes this very interesting USO incident which occurred in 1964. The exact date is unknown, but the main witness is an Air Force pilot who flew in World War II, and his name is Frank S. Kinsey. So a good witness, someone who is familiar with aircraft. And he was visiting Lake Casitas with his brother-in-law because they were interested in seeing this relatively newly formed lake. And they were there not long when suddenly something very strange happened. Their attention was drawn to the lake by the sound of splashing water, and it was a lot of it. And as Frank Kinsey says, and I quote, "I looked out into the lake, and here's this object coming out of the water." This case was researched by MUFON field investigator Robert D. Neville. And according to the report on this case, the object that Frank and his brother saw was quite large, 30 feet across. It was a perfectly round, spherical object with a weird cone on top. The cone had portholes and was staying still while the object itself beneath it, the round part, was spinning furiously. So this object came out of the water with such high speed that it sucked up a large column of water, which came loudly crashing down, and that's what drew the attention of Frank Kinsey and his brother-in-law. As Frank says, and I quote, "When it came out of the water, it was like a funnel sucking up water. It brought the water with it due to the fact that it was whirling so fast. I was flabbergasted. It was a round object, and it looked like it had a cone on top where a person was looking out at us, a being looking out at us. I could see the eyes staring at us. I happened to have a pair of binoculars with me at the time. I picked them up and looked, and I could see a person looking out at me." So yeah, this was a large object. Frank estimates 30 feet wide. And as I mentioned earlier, the outside perimeter was rotating quickly and was emitting a noise that, according to Frank Kinsey, was so loud it was almost painful to his ears. And he could see several portholes situated around this top cone section of this object. And it was through one of these portholes that he could see this being. According to Frank Kinsey, this was not a normal-looking window by any means. As he says, and I quote, "It looked like it was real thick, heavy glass of some kind. Or maybe it might have been a plastic of some kind." So as he's watching this object floating about 30 feet up, it was glowing sort of this dark lavender color. And as it started to move away, it glowed bright orange yellow. And in just a few seconds, it darted so quickly it was about 15 miles away and disappeared over the mountain. As Frank Kinsey says, "It had a gleam to it. It had a shine to it like nothing I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of metals here on Earth that had a high gloss, but nothing like this that I've ever seen." Now, Frank Kinsey did have a camera hanging around his neck. He forgot about it at first because he was so surprised. But as this object first started to move away, he grabbed his camera and was able to snap one picture, one photograph of this object as it moved off. And you can see from this photo that this is in fact a solid object, and in fact you can even see the portholes. What's amazing is that he was able to capture a photograph of this object, and it's obviously a solid metallic object. What it was doing there in Lake Casitas is hard to say. There are many, many cases of USOs in what we would call reservoirs or human-made bodies of water. They seem to hold a particular interest in these types of bodies of water. So perhaps it was there to investigate. Hard to say, but it is absolutely an unusual case. There are cases where people have seen occupants looking out through portholes. But as far as I know, no one has ever seen an occupant looking out of the porthole of a USO that just came out of the water while also managing to photograph it. So that makes this case absolutely unique in all of the UFO literature. As far as I know, it's the only case like it. But as I mentioned earlier, these 3 cases are just a small portion of the many, many cases that have occurred in this particular area. I covered these 3 cases and more than 100 others in my book, Undersea UFO Base, an in-depth investigation into USOs in the Santa Catalina Channel. But again, very few of these cases involve humanoids, and that's really why I wanted to do this episode today. It's such an active area. And in fact, this is the same exact area where the U.S. Navy has recently reported seeing unidentified objects flying over their ships. And also even more recently, in fact, in 2021, this year, there was more activity. I recently appeared on Josh Gates's show, Expedition X, to talk about the activity in this area. And they went out there with their crew to try and capture these USOs on film, and were successful. Captured at least 3 USO incidents on camera in this exact area. So something is definitely going on here. It's a very active area and still ongoing, and I think it's important people know about it, which is yet another reason why I wanted to do this episode. But that's it for now. I want to thank you once again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and until next time, keep having fun.